Inside the packed mathematics auditorium of Blackstone University, more than 200 people burst into laughter as Professor Evelyn Carrington pointed at the janitor leaning on a mop at the back of the room. He can't even count cleaning supplies correctly, and you think he understands advanced theorem structures. Her voice dripped with contempt. The crowd took it as a joke. The man said nothing. He removed his work gloves, walked to the chalkboard, and stared at the unsolved problem that had defeated the room for 3 hours. Then he picked up the chalk. The auditorium had not always known him by his face. For most of the past 4 years, Nathan Cole had moved through Blackstone University. After midnight, a tall man in gray coveralls who pushed a mop bucket down the corridors of the mathematics building while the city outside slept. He cleaned the chalkboards last, always last, because he liked to read what had been left there before he erased it. No one had ever caught him doing it. No one had ever looked long enough to catch him. He lived in a one-bedroom walk-up, 2 blocks from the elevated train, in a building where the radiators hissed all winter and the windows never sealed right. The rent was late more often than it was on time. During the day, he repaired industrial sewing machines in a small workshop off Cermak Road. And at night, he came here to the Cathedral of Theorems and tenured chairs, and he scrubbed their floors for a wage that barely covered the heat. He kept to himself. He did not ask questions. He did not stay where he was not paid to stay. What no one in the building knew was that Nathan had once sat in classrooms very much like these. He had been a sophomore in pure mathematics at a small university in Iowa when his father's medical debt collapsed the family. He had left school in the middle of a semester and had never gone back. The textbooks he could not afford to buy, he found in the discard bins of the Blackstone Library, hauled out for recycling at the end of each academic year. He read them on the train. He read them on his breaks. He filled the margins with his own work in a steady, careful hand, and he told no one. Professor Evelyn Carrington was the face of the department. Her photograph hung in the lobby beside 2 former Fields Medal nominees, and her lectures filled the largest hall on campus. She had built her reputation on the unshakable conviction that real mathematics belonged to a particular kind of mind, raised in a particular kind of room, and that the rest of the world was background scenery. To her, the man who emptied her wastebasket at 2 in the morning was furniture that moved on its own. The symposium that night was the flagship event of the spring calendar, hosted personally by Evelyn, drawing department chairs and visiting scholars from across the country. The centerpiece she had chosen herself, an incomplete theorem in algebraic topology, a problem that had circulated quietly among specialists for nearly a decade, without anyone publishing a clean proof. She framed it as a matter of honor. The room would solve it together on the board in real time. For 3 hours they tried. A visiting professor from Stanford filled half the board with a chain of substitutions that collapsed when a graduate student spotted a sign error. A theorist from Berkeley argued for a topological approach that Evelyn dismissed within 20 minutes. Chalk dust hung in the warm air. Coffee cups accumulated on the side tables. By the 3rd hour, the energy in the room had turned tight and sour the way crowded rooms do when no one wants to admit they are stuck. Nathan was working the back row. He moved between the seats with a soft cloth, wiping down the wooden armrests, listening, because he could not help listening. He had read about the problem 2 summers earlier, in a journal someone had thrown out behind the faculty lounge, and he had thought about it on the train for months afterward. He had thought about it, in fact, until he had understood something the room in front of him had not. The error was not in any of the steps they had written down. It was older than that. It lived in the assumption they had all accepted before they even picked up the chalk, a small, quiet assumption about how the underlying space behaved at its boundary. From that one mistake, every path forward bent the wrong way. They were not failing to solve the problem. They were solving a different problem, one that did not exist. He did not mean to say it out loud. The words left him almost under his breath, somewhere between a thought and a comment to no one. "The premise is wrong," he said at once quietly, while wiping down the armrest of an empty seat in the 4th row from the back. 2 graduate students in the row ahead of him turned around. One of them, A young man named Daniel Hayes laughed first, a short, surprised laugh, and the other followed. The sound carried. Within seconds, half the room had turned to look at the back, where a man in gray coveralls stood holding a cleaning cloth in one hand. Evelyn stepped down from the platform. She walked up the center aisle with the patient half-smile of someone who had decided to enjoy what was about to happen. She stopped 2 rows from him and addressed the auditorium without taking her eyes off his face. "It seems," she said, "that we have a contribution from the back of the room." A few people chuckled. She let them. Then she gestured at his cart at the mop, at the row of cleaning bottles lined up along the lower shelf. "He can't even count cleaning supplies correctly, and you think he understands advanced theorem structures." The laughter came in a wave, then the kind that fills a hall and presses against the walls. Nathan stood still inside it. He had been small in rooms before. He had been smaller than this. What he felt was not humiliation exactly. It was something quieter and older, the recognition that the world had once again decided in advance where he was allowed to stand. He looked down at his hands, at the cracked skin across his knuckles, at the cleaning cloth folded between his fingers. He thought about the apartment 2 blocks from the elevated train, about the stack of unopened bills on the kitchen counter, about the careful arithmetic he ran every Friday afternoon to make a paycheck last another week. He thought about the textbooks in the milk crate under his bed, the ones with his handwriting in the margins. He thought about how easy it would be to turn around, push the cart through the side door, and keep his job. No one in this room would ever look for him again. He set the cleaning cloth down on the armrest of the empty seat. He took off his work gloves one at a time and folded them neatly into the front pocket of his coveralls. The laughter in the room thinned as the people closest to him registered what he was doing. He stepped past the graduate students and walked down the center aisle past Evelyn, who watched him go with the same half-smile fixed on her face. The mop bucket stayed where it was. At the front of the room, he stopped in front of the chalkboard. The unsolved problem covered the upper third of the surface, and 3 hours of failed work crowded beneath it in tight, anxious handwriting. He took a piece of chalk from the tray. The room behind him had gone very quiet now. Even Evelyn was quiet. She had returned to the front of the platform and stood with her arms loosely crossed, waiting for him to fail in a way that would justify everything she had already said. Nathan did not turn around to look at her. He kept his eyes on the board. He raised the chalk and held it there for a long moment, just above the surface, as if measuring a distance no one else in the room could see. Nathan began at the upper left corner of the board, just under the original statement of the theorem. He did not erase any of the existing work. He drew a small vertical line down the middle of the open space and started writing on the right-hand side, letting the failed attempts stand as their own evidence. His handwriting was small, and even the kind of hand that came from years of writing in margins. The chalk made a clean, soft sound against the slate. A murmur rose almost at once. The notation he chose was older than what most of the room used, a compact shorthand from a textbook published in the late 1970s that had long since fallen out of fashion. A graduate student near the front leaned over to her neighbor and whispered something. 2 rows behind her, a visiting lecturer let out a short, dry laugh that he tried to cover by clearing his throat. Professor Richard Brennan, the Berkeley theorist Evelyn had dismissed earlier, stood up from his seat in the 3rd row. Whatever resentment he carried toward her seemed to matter less than the prospect of a janitor at his own board. "I'm sorry," he said, in a voice loud enough to carry. "Could you tell us what you think that symbol means? Because at this institution we generally use modern conventions." A small ripple of laughter answered him. Brennan remained standing, arms folded across his chest, waiting. Nathan answered without turning. "It means the same thing either way. The older form is shorter. I'll switch if it helps." He kept writing. The line he was building reached the bottom of the board's right-hand side, and he started a second column underneath the first. Daniel Hayes, the graduate student who had laughed first from the back row, had moved down to the 2nd row at some point during the walk to the front. He was leaning forward now, elbows on his knees, watching the chalk move. The smile he had worn earlier was gone. He said nothing. What Nathan was doing, slowly and without commentary, was tracing a single thread through the 3 hours of failed work above him. He drew a small arrow, connecting one of the Stanford professor's substitutions to a step Evelyn herself had written near the top, and then another arrow back to the original statement of the theorem. The arrows formed a closed loop. Inside that loop, in 2 small letters, he wrote a question mark. "This is the assumption," he said, still facing the board. Everyone in this room accepted it before the work started. You assumed the underlying space behaves the same way at its boundary as it does in the interior. It doesn't. Once that's true, every step above this line is solving a problem that doesn't exist. The murmuring died. Evelyn moved closer to the board. She did not interrupt yet. She read what he had written, and then she read it again, and the muscle along her jaw tightened in a way the front rows could see. The auditorium had shifted around him without him needing to ask for it. The graduate students in the lower rows had set down their phones. The visiting scholars had stopped exchanging the small, knowing glances they had been trading all evening. Even Brennan slowly sat back down. The hall had stopped watching a janitor at a chalkboard. It was watching something else now, something it had not come prepared to see. Nathan kept working. From the closed loop and the question mark, he opened a new line of reasoning. He did not argue against the failed attempts above him. He simply ignored them and built downward from a clean foundation he had drawn at the bottom of the board. The structure was strange. It did not follow the path any of the experts had tried. It folded the problem in half, along an axis no one in the room had thought to look for. "What he's doing," said a quiet voice from somewhere near the center of the auditorium, "is reframing the entire boundary condition." It was a woman this time, an older mathematician named Margaret Whitlock from the visiting committee. She was leaning forward in her seat, her glasses pushed up into her hair, watching the board with the absorbed stillness of someone who had forgotten she was in a room with other people. Evelyn heard her. Evelyn heard everything. She turned her head a fraction of an inch toward Whitlock and then back to the board, and for the first time that evening, her face was not arranged in any particular expression. She was reading the work. She was reading it the way she read papers submitted to journals, where she sat on the review board with the slow, precise attention of someone trying to find the seam that would let her tear it apart. She could not find one. The man in gray coveralls in front of the chalkboard wasn't guessing. He was not improvising. He was working from a structure he had clearly carried inside his head for a long time, and the structure was correct. Worse than that, it was elegant. It was the kind of elegance she had spent her career teaching her students to recognize and to produce and to defend against lesser minds. She had never produced it herself, and she knew it. The recognition arrived in her chest like a small, cold weight that had not been there a minute ago. The hall sensed the shift before it understood it. The laughter that had filled it when Evelyn first pointed at him was gone now, and it was not coming back the same way. Whatever the next hour held, it was no longer going to be the story she had walked in with. Evelyn moved. She stepped up onto the platform beside him, close enough that he had to feel her there, and she addressed the board rather than him. "Let's slow down," she said in the measured voice she used in graduate seminars. "I'd like to see this proven rigorously, step by step, to the standard we hold ourselves to in this department." Nathan lowered the chalk. "Your transition from the third line to the fourth," she went on. "You're claiming a continuity result. Show me. Cite the theorem. Walk us through the conditions." She gestured at the board, as if inviting him to a chair. Her tone was perfectly polite. It was the politeness of a closing door. He looked at the line she meant. He knew it was true. He had known it was true for years. He had arrived at it the way he arrived at most things in his work, by turning the object over in his head on the train, by drawing it on napkins, by following the shape of it, until the shape became obvious. He had never been asked to cite a theorem by name. He had never been required to lay it down in the formal sequence a referee would want to see. He had read those theorems. He could feel which one he was using. He could not in that moment remember the name on the paper that had first published it. "It follows from a standard continuity argument," he said. "Which one?" Evelyn was not asking. She was waiting. He named one. It was close, but it was not exactly right, and the lecturer from Stanford in the second row caught it and let out a small sound. Brennan stood up again. The pressure shifted then. It came at him from 3 directions at once. Brennan questioned the next line. The Stanford lecturer questioned the line after that. A young assistant professor on the far aisle, eager to be seen contributing, demanded that Nathan formally define a term he had used without comment 4 minutes earlier. The questions were not unfair. They were the questions the room would have asked any speaker. They were also exactly the questions a man who had taught himself out of discarded textbooks had never been required to answer in front of 200 people. Nathan answered the first one. He answered the second one more slowly. The third one he answered correctly, but in language that was a decade out of date, and Brennan corrected him with a small, satisfied tightening of the mouth. The fourth question caught him between 2 ways of saying the same thing, and he stopped in the middle of a sentence to find the right word, and the silence that followed was longer than it should have been. Evelyn watched the silence. She did not fill it. She let it sit in the hall until everyone in it felt it. He reached the second to last step. The board behind him was almost full now, his clean handwriting threading through and around the failed work of the 3 hours before him. The structure he had built was still standing. He could see the final move he needed to make. He had seen it from the moment he picked up the chalk. The trouble was that the move did not look on the board the way it looked in his head. To write it down in a form the room would accept. He needed a piece of formal machinery he had read about once in a journal 3 years ago and had never used. He started the line. He wrote 3 symbols. He stopped. He looked at what he had written and knew it was wrong, or at least that it was not yet right, and he could not in that moment see how to fix it. His hand stayed lifted near the board. A small white smudge of chalk dust had settled across the back of his wrist. Behind him the laughter began to return. It was quieter this time, and meaner, because it had been held back so long. It came first from the assistant professor on the far aisle, who turned to his neighbor with a small, relieved smile, and then it spread through the middle rows, 2 and 3 people at a time, the way a fire moves through dry grass. Brennan crossed his arms again and looked openly satisfied. Evelyn stepped a little closer. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. "This," she said gently enough that only the first 10 rows clearly heard her, "is why mathematics is not for amateurs." The line carried. The people in the back leaned forward and asked the people in front what she had said, and the words traveled backward through the auditorium in a slow ripple. By the time it reached the last row, the laughter had reached it too. Nathan stood with his back to all of it. The chalkboard in front of him was almost full, almost all of it his work, and one unfinished line at the bottom that refused to close. His hand was still lifted. The tremor in his fingers was small, but it was real, and he could see the white dust shake faintly against the dark of the slate. He thought very clearly that he should have stayed at the back of the room. He thought about the mop bucket still standing in the aisle behind him, abandoned now, and slightly tilted on the carpet. He thought about the bills on the kitchen counter, about how late he would already be when he finally got home. He thought about how easy it had been to believe for 40 minutes that the room had been wrong about him. He lowered the chalk. He did not turn around. The laughter behind him went on soft and certain, the sound of a place returning to the shape it had always meant to hold. It was the soft, settled sound of a room that had decided how the evening was going to end, and was waiting now only for him to confirm it. Nathan did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the unfinished line at the bottom of the board, and on the 3 small symbols he had written there in the wrong order. He stood very still inside the noise. He thought for the first time since he had walked down the aisle about what he was actually trying to do. He had been answering their questions. He had been citing their theorems in their language, in the order they wanted to hear them in. He had been climbing a ladder that someone else had built against the wrong wall, rung by careful rung, and he had been doing it because he had spent his entire adult life being told that this was the only ladder there was. The proof in his head did not look like that. It had never looked like that. It was not a sequence of citations. It was a shape. He had seen it on the train one winter morning, watching the way the steel beams of the elevated track folded across each other above the platform at Garfield, and he had understood, the way a person understands the geometry of a hand they have known their whole life, that the boundary of the space in the theorem behaved the same way those beams did. The whole problem collapsed into something smaller and cleaner the moment you let yourself see it from the side instead of from above. He had never written it down that way. He had been afraid to. He had spent 40 minutes at this board trying to translate a shape into a citation, and the translation was killing him. The room behind him was not laughing because he was wrong. It was laughing because he had agreed to fight on terms that did not belong to him. He thought then about the milk crate of textbooks under his bed, about the careful handwriting in the margins, and he understood that he had two choices left in the next 60 seconds. He could finish the line the way the room wanted it finished badly, and walk out the side door with what was left of his dignity. Or he could trust the thing he had carried in his head for 9 years, and let the room see it the way he had seen it the first time. He raised his free hand and pressed it flat against the board. He dragged his palm across the slate. He erased the bottom half of his own work, the careful sequence of citations and formal steps he had built under Evelyn's questioning the line that had stopped him cold a minute earlier. He did not erase the question mark inside the closed loop at the top, and he did not erase the original statement of the theorem. Everything else he wiped clean. White chalk dust drifted down the front of his coveralls and settled along the platform at his feet. The laughter behind him broke off, not all at once. The first few people fell quiet, and then the rows behind them, and then the back of the auditorium, the way a wind dies through a field of grass. By the time he set down the eraser, the only sound left in the hall was the soft scrape of his own breathing. He picked up the chalk again. He started at the cleared space in the middle of the board, and he did not write a single citation. He drew a figure instead. It wasn't the kind of figure the room expected. It looked at first like two crossed beams of an old industrial frame, the way you might sketch a piece of machinery on the back of a work order. He drew it small and clean, and then he labeled the corners. "This is the space in the theorem," he said. His voice was steady now, in a way it had not been a minute ago. Looked at from the side. He drew a second figure beside it, identical to the first, but rotated by a quarter turn. And this is the space looked at from above. The boundary behaves differently in the two views. Every proof attempted in this room tonight has used the second view. The theorem is asking about the first. He began then to fold the problem along the axis the room had not seen. He worked downward from the figures, and the work did not look like any of the failed attempts above it. It did not need citations. It needed the figures, and a small number of clean, almost geometric steps, each one of which any honest person in the auditorium could verify by looking at the picture beside it. He used the older notation again, and this time no one corrected him, because the older notation made the figures fit the page. Margaret Whitlock leaned forward in her seat. Her glasses were still pushed up into her hair. Her mouth was slightly open. She did not seem to know it was open. Brennan, 2 rows in front of her, had stopped folding his arms. His hands rested on his knees, now very still. Nathan kept writing. The figures multiplied along the lower half of the board. Each one reduced the problem by a little more. By the third figure, the structure was unmistakable. By the fifth, the path to the end of the proof was visible the way the end of a tunnel becomes visible long before you reach it. By the sixth, he was no longer proving the theorem. He was proving something larger than the theorem. He stopped. He looked at what he had drawn. He went back to the original statement of the problem at the top of the board, and he drew a small bracket around it, and beside the bracket, he wrote in his careful, even hand, a new statement. It was the same theorem generalized. It covered not only the case the symposium had been called to solve, but an entire family of cases that the original statement had not even named. The generalization was 3 lines long. It was the kind of result that, written on a different board in a different room by a different person, would have ended careers and started others. He set the chalk down on the tray. He stepped back from the board. The auditorium was completely silent. It was the silence of 200 people who had all stopped breathing at approximately the same moment and had not yet remembered to start again. Then Margaret Whitlock stood up. She did not say anything. She just stood. She was a small woman, and her standing was not dramatic, but in the silence of that hall, it carried like a struck bell. A man in the row behind her stood next. Then the Stanford lecturer in the second row, who had laughed at Nathan's notation 40 minutes earlier, rose to his feet without taking his eyes off the board. Then Brennan slowly, almost reluctantly, but he stood. Then the row behind him, then the whole center of the auditorium in a long, uneven wave that traveled outward to the walls. The applause when it came was not the polite applause that ends a lecture. It was the other kind. It was loud and uneven, and it went on for a long time, and several people in the middle rows were applauding with their hands raised above their heads, as if they wanted the man at the board to be certain they meant it. Evelyn Carrington had not moved from the edge of the platform. She stood 3 feet from him with her arms at her sides. The half-smile she had worn for most of the evening was gone, and what had replaced it was not anger, and not embarrassment, but something flatter and more honest than either of those, the expression of a person who had just watched the floor of her own house give way beneath her. She looked at the board. She looked at the generalization in the small, careful handwriting at the top. She looked finally at Nathan. She did not speak for a long moment. The applause around her made the silence between them easier to hold. When she finally raised her voice to be heard over the room, it was quieter than anyone in the front rows expected. "What you have just shown us," she said, "is a proof I have not seen in this department, in any journal, or in any conference of my career. It is original, it is correct, and it is yours." Her voice did not break. It did not soften either. It was the voice of a woman saying something true because there was nothing else left in the room to say. She did not apologize. She did not look at the rest of the auditorium. She turned, and she walked off the platform, and she walked up the center aisle past the standing rows and out through the doors at the back of the hall. She did not come back. The journal accepted the paper 4 months later. It appeared in the autumn issue in the lead position, with a brief introductory note from the editors describing the result as the most important contribution to the field in nearly a decade. The author line carried one name, Nathan Cole. There was no institutional affiliation listed beneath it. The editors had asked. He had told them he did not have one. He still lived in the walk-up near the elevated train. He still rode the same line to work in the mornings, and he still repaired industrial sewing machines in the small workshop off Kermack Road in the afternoons. He had given up the night shift at Blackstone University. The department had offered him a visiting position and a research stipend and a small office on the 3rd floor with his name on a piece of cardstock taped to the door. He had accepted the office. He used it 3 afternoons a week. The rest of the time he was on the train, or at the workshop, or at his kitchen table working in the margins of books that no longer had to be discarded to reach him. Professor Evelyn Carrington had taken a sabbatical at the end of that spring semester. She did not return in the fall. The faculty website removed her photograph from the rotation in the lobby without any particular announcement. Where she went, no one in the department said out loud and no one asked. Daniel Hayes, the graduate student who had laughed first from the back row that night, became one of the first people to sign up for the small reading group Nathan led on Thursday afternoons in the 3rd floor office. He was a quiet member. He took good notes. People in the building who had walked past Nathan for 4 years without seeing him now stopped him in the hallway to shake his hand. He shook each of them. He did not bring up the night in the auditorium. Neither did they. It was understood, in the way these things are understood in buildings full of polite people, that the story belonged to the room it had happened in. What he carried out of that room, he carried quietly. He had not gone there to win anything. He had gone there to clean the floor. The board had simply asked a question he already knew the answer to, And a woman with a microphone had told 200 people that he was not allowed to answer it, and he had answered it anyway. Knowledge does not belong to a title. Intelligence does not wear a suit, and it does not stand on a platform. And sometimes the person the whole room has decided to laugh at is the only person in it who has actually understood the question.